In today's episode, we're out here in the forest taking a look at the 2017 Toyota Highlander. For the 2017 model year, Toyota gave one of the most popular crossovers in America a very significant refresh that results in more power under the hood and greater efficiency. Then Toyota tossed in a boatload of standard safety features even in the base LE trim, and that combines to make the Highlander one of the best values in the mid-size crossover segment. You'll notice down there in the title section that this review covers the 2017 and 2018 Highlander because we don't expect to see any changes for 2018. Just a light reshuffling of options and, of course, a little bit of a price increase. The biggest change for the Highlander happens up front, and I'm not just talking about this larger and much bolder grille on the hybrid model that we're testing this week. I'm also talking about what's behind the front end, because behind this Toyota logo sits a new standard radar sensor. The radar sensor and a camera located behind the windscreen give all models of the Highlander Toyota's latest active safety systems, including radar adaptive cruise control, pre-collision warning with autonomous braking and pedestrian detection, lane keeping assistance, and automatic high beams. The 2017 Highlander is 1.4 inches longer than the 2016 Highlander at 192.5 inches long overall. The size increase for the Highlander happens mainly in the front and the rear bumpers. However, we don't find any more interior space in the 2017 model than we found in the 2016 model. And that means that the Highlander is still towards the smaller end of the mid-size three-row crossover segment. Three-row crossovers generally seem to fall into two categories: vehicles that are about this size, like the Sorento, the Highlander, the Pilot, and the new GMC Acadia, or vehicles that are sort of a half step larger than this, like the Explorer, the Pathfinder, and the new Chevy Traverse. Out back, things change a little bit less from 2016 to 2017 than we saw up front. We have these new tail lamp modules that wrap from the body on over to the tailgate lid, and they have an integrated light pipe that you can see illuminated right there. Cargo practicality is definitely a strong suit for the Highlander, even though this is not as large as some of those larger three-row crossovers. And part of that has to do with this separately opening rear window. This is a feature that I really like in crossovers and SUVs, but it's kind of a dying thing. We don't really see very many crossovers out there with a separately opening rear glass. The reason for that, of course, is that this is more expensive to manufacture than having something that doesn't open separately from the tailgate, but it does mean that the vehicle is overall more practical. Because if you have to put long items in the vehicle, large pipes or pieces of wood or something like that, it's more of a pain to open the hatch completely like this and then have them dangling out than to have the hatch closed and have that glass open. Continuing the theme of most of the changes for the 2017 model year happening up front, we find some significant changes under the hood. Now, you'll still find a 2.7-liter four-cylinder engine in the base model of the Highlander, producing 185 horsepower, and that is still mated to a 6-speed automatic, sending power to the front wheels only. Most of the Highlanders you'll see on the dealer lots will have the same 3.5-liter V6 engine that we're driving right here. In the non-hybrid trim, it produces 295 horsepower and 263 pound-feet of torque, and it features all of Toyota's latest fuel-saving innovations, including direct injection, the ability to run on an Atkinson cycle to improve fuel economy, start-stop is standard in top-end trims, and we have a new 8-speed automatic transmission. Interestingly enough, this is the same 8-speed automatic that we find in the Lexus RX 350. Front-wheel drive is standard with the V6, but of course all-wheel drive is available. Then we get the model we're driving right here, which uses basically the same 3.5-liter V6, but adds a hybrid system. Now, the engine output does drop in the hybrid model, but the electric motors compensate for that, giving us actually more horsepower than we find in the non-hybrid model and slightly better 0 to 60 performance. Thanks to all of the fuel-saving technologies that Toyota has thrown onto the 3.5-liter V6, you'll actually get better fuel economy in it than in the 2.7-liter four-cylinder model. In fact, all-wheel drive versions of the Highlander V6 actually get the same combined fuel economy score as the front-wheel drive 2.7-liter model. As we see with a few other electric hybrid all-wheel drive vehicles out there, like Toyota's own RAV4 hybrid, or the Acura MDX hybrid, or even the Volvo XC90 hybrid, there is no mechanical connection between the engine and the rear wheels. So all the power going to the rear wheels is generated by that 68 horsepower electric motor. Obviously, the software tries to balance power front to rear if there's wheel slip, but you're never going to get more than that 68 horsepower out back. That means that in general terms, the mechanical all-wheel drive system that we find in the non-hybrid Highlander is going to be more capable off-road than the model that we're driving right here. Because if the going were to get really sticky, that Highlander, in theory, could send almost all of the engine power to the rear wheels. This vehicle can't. Of course, the biggest difference between the Highlander and the Highlander Hybrid is going to be the curb weight, because this vehicle weighs nearly 5,000 pounds when fully equipped, and that's quite heavy for a three-row crossover that's this size. In fact, the Highlander Hybrid is just about as heavy as the plug-in hybrid Chrysler Pacifica minivan. Front seat comfort comes in at 9 out of 10 points. LE Plus and above get a two-way lumbar support for the driver's seat, and the model we're driving also has an extending thigh cushion. However, you don't find four-way adjustable lumbar support up front like we do find in some of the competition. The tilt telescopic steering column has a moderate range of motion, and we have a decent amount of headroom even though we are in the model with the optional sunroof. One thing to keep in mind is that the passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat, even in top-end trims. So in this particular model, the passenger seat does not have the extending thigh cushion or the two-way lumbar. The second row seats are among the most comfortable in this segment, even though the Highlander is not among the largest. The second row slides forward and backward to help apportion legroom front and rear a little bit more equitably. These seats also have a large amount of recline, and headroom is very generous back here. I have about 3 inches left, whether I'm in the outboard seat or in the center seat. The second row bench seat features a fold-down center armrest with 2 large cup holders and a shoulder belt that comes out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling. That is my preference because it means that if you put a child seat in the center using the shoulder belt, it's going to be a little better centered than some of the other options. Hopping into the third row is fairly easy. We just tilt and slide the second row seats forward and then close the door behind us and slide things back into position. Keeping in mind that the Highlander is on the smaller end of the three-row crossover scale, I'm still going to give these rear seats 7 out of 10 points. And that's because headroom is surprisingly generous back here. Now, you won't find the same kind of combined legroom that we find in the Traverse, the Pathfinder, or the Ford Explorer. Those will have several inches more legroom, combined front row plus second row plus third row, but you still could fit 6 6-foot-tall adults in this vehicle if you needed to. And there's actually enough headroom back here that my hair is brushing the ceiling, but my head is not touching the ceiling. Now, admittedly, this headrest does hit me in kind of a funny place in the back. A definite consideration with the Highlander is that the rear bench is not as wide as the second row bench, and this is still a 3-person bench seat back here. Behind the rear hatch, we find 13.8 cubic feet of cargo area, exactly the same as the 2016 model year. That's enough to put 2 22-inch roller bags in this position across the back, or you could line up 3 of them right like that behind the third row. This is a little bit more room than you'll find in the Kia Sorento at 11 cubic feet, but definitely behind the Ford Explorer at 21. This is roughly the same amount of storage space that you'll find in a Honda Pilot or a Nissan Pathfinder. But if you're the kind of family that actually needs to carry 6 or 7 people and 6 or 7 people's worth of luggage, you will find considerably more cargo room and more third row room in a Toyota Sienna. Lifting up the cargo area load floor reveals just a little bit more storage room and a well large enough to put a 22-inch roller bag right like that. And then over on this side, we find the jack and the tire iron. Of course, most Highlander owners are likely going to keep the third row folded most of the time, and in this case, you'll get nearly 50 cubic feet of storage capacity, definitely more than your average compact or mid-sized 2-row crossover. As we take a look around the inside, keep in mind we are in one of the upper level trims, so we do have the moonroof right there, and we also have the rear seat entertainment system in this particular model. The driver and the front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests. Our model has the heated leather seats. As I said before, the seats are not identical for the driver and the front passenger, so the front passenger does not get the extending thigh cushion or the 2-way adjustable lumbar support. The front doors are made from a combination of soft touch plastics up above, some soft touch inserts right here, and a soft touch armrest. And then it's hard to see in the video, but we also have some contrasting features right here. So this is actually a brown section right there between more charcoal colored pieces. The brown inserts match the brown stitching on the seats and the brown soft touch plastics that we find here in the dashboard storage area. This storage area stretches from the center of the dashboard on over there to the passenger side and very easily accommodates large smartphones like this iPhone 7 Plus right here. There's also a cable pass-through that allows you to go from this tier right here through this hole down to the 12-volt power outlet, auxiliary input, USB input, and the 2 USB charge-only ports. The upper section of the dashboard is a soft-touch injection molded material that's designed to give the appearance of stitching. In the center of the dashboard, we find the digital clock. Below that, we have a single-slot optical disc player, and then a touchscreen infotainment and navigation system. Right now, you'll see this has Driver Easy Speak listed there as one of the options on the home page. That's sort of a one-way intercom system for the car. It helps you speak to the third row passengers especially a little bit more easily. This is a one-way intercom, so it does not help amplify their voices for talking back to the driver. Homepage options are rearrangeable, but one thing you'll notice about this particular system is that we don't have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto support in this system. Although we don't have CarPlay or Android Auto, we do have album art, and we have complete voice command of your music library. The system also features one of the more advanced Bluetooth interfaces that I've seen in a modern vehicle, with the ability to actually browse your Bluetooth media library from this interface. Below that, we find the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control system. We'll skip over this area since we've already seen it. Pull back the shifter, and then you'll notice we have 3 buttons in this particular model. There's a traction control enable disable button, an eco mode button, and an EV mode button because of course we are driving the hybrid. Behind that, we have 2 large cup holders and then a gated style shifter. It hops and bops sideways as it moves to the drive position towards the driver. If you want the manual mode, that's even further over to the left. We push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. Behind that, we find the controls for the heated seats. Between the front seats, we have kind of an unusual center console. This is actually a soft touch material. You can see it right there bending under my finger, both there on the sides and right here in the middle, although it does get a little harder right here in the seam between these 2 areas. This is actually a roller style opening. It actually slides in 2 ways, this section separately from that back section, and then we have an enormous storage area down here. You could very easily put 2 large gallons of milk right in here and still close the lid. It's a little hard to see it, but right down here we also have a 12-volt power outlet. Because we're driving the hybrid model, we get a unique instrument cluster that features a power, eco, and charge gauge on the left instead of a tachometer. We still have the traditional analog speedometer on the right. Between the 2 gauges, we have a color multifunction display that gives us things like our trip computer readout information, the energy monitor, of course, because we're in a hybrid, and of course, some of the safety system readouts, like this driver alert warning that tells you when you need to take a break based on your driving habits. We also get turn-by-turn navigation directions and media information. There's also a display specifically for the active safety systems, as well as vehicle messages, and then we have the option to control some of those vehicle safety systems with this display. You can control the sensitivity of the pre-collision warning system and the lane departure prevention. Moving out from there, we find a steering wheel with sport grips up top and a large spoke right here in the center. As we see in other Toyota models, the controls for the cruise control is on a stalk that moves with the steering wheel, and then we adjust the following distance with this button right here. You can use this to turn on and off the lane departure prevention system, and then these buttons control that multifunction display between the speedometer and the power gauge. On the left side of the wheel, we find the buttons for the infotainment system, a voice command button, and dedicated phone hang-up and pickup. To the left of the steering wheel, we find Toyota's typical button bank. This is where you can enable and disable the auto high beams that are standard in every model. There's a button for the power tailgate, the windshield wiper de-icer, and a small storage cubby. As we start the drive section, it's important to keep in mind that the 2017 Highlander is a refresh, not a complete redesign. So much of what was going on in the 2016 Highlander is still here in the 2017 Highlander. However, acceleration does change because we get that new, more powerful V6 engine in the hybrid model and in the regular V6 model, although the 4-cylinder base engine remains exactly the same. So acceleration times in that 4-cylinder model are the same 2016 to 2017, but for this V6 model, things drop down to 7.0 seconds, 0 to 60, and that's for the non-hybrid model. If you get the hybrid model, which is what we're driving right here, then it drops even further down to 6.9. That may surprise some of you because the hybrid model doesn't produce that much more horsepower than the non-hybrid model, but it does weigh considerably more. This vehicle is about a cupcake shy of 5,000 pounds. This is quite a heavy 3-row crossover, especially considering that this is on the smaller end of the scale overall. However, the hybrid system has a few advantages. The electric motor has a massive amount of low-end torque, there's no wasted time shifting, and of course this system can keep the engine at the optimum RPM for acceleration at all times. The Highlander compares fairly well with the competition in terms of overall acceleration, as you can see on that chart down there. This is notably faster than the Mazda CX-9. That CX-9 is a little bit disappointing in terms of acceleration, but Mazda says that they designed that vehicle for improved feel, not necessarily outright 0 to 60 numbers. Either way, this is definitely going to beat it at the stoplight races. Something like a twin-turbo Ford Explorer would definitely be faster than this, but this will be faster than Hyundai's Santa Fe. In our braking test, this took 127 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That drops down to a very respectable 116 if you get the regular V6 version. That means that this hybrid model takes about 8 to 10 feet longer than the average 3-row crossover in America to stop from 60 miles an hour, but the non-hybrid model is actually among the shorter ones. When it comes to handling, it really depends on what you want to compare the Highlander to. This Highlander hybrid model, as I said earlier, is quite heavy. In fact, this is about the same kind of curb weight as Chrysler's all-new plug-in hybrid minivan, which has a much larger battery. Therefore, it really should be no surprise that in most circumstances, the Highlander Hybrid will handle just about the same as that Chrysler Pacifica minivan, or perhaps even a little bit worse, because this carries its weight a little bit higher up, and the Pacifica has its weight a little bit closer to the ground, and that actually does help improve handling. Versus the average three-row crossover, this is definitely not going to be the handling winner, and this is going to fall pretty far behind something like the Acura MDX Hybrid. If we shift over to the non-hybrid versions of the Highlander, the base LE trim is the one that's going to handle the best because it still uses 245 with tires, but it has the lightest curb weight. It's just under 4,200 pounds. That's a significant weight difference between this model and that base LE trim, and you will definitely notice it if you drive them back to back. Of course, not many shoppers out there will end up with the LE trim of the Highlander because it is front-wheel drive only and you can't get any options in that model. The handling champion for the mainstream crossover segment is definitely the Mazda CX-9. Not only is it about 500 pounds lighter than a comparably equipped Highlander, and I'm talking about the non-hybrid model, of course, but it also has very wide tires for this mainstream segment. You'll find 255 with tires in most versions of the CX-9. On the flip side, the heavier curb weight and the softer suspension combine to give this one of the best rides in the crossover segment, so I'm definitely going to give this an A. You'll certainly feel more of the bumps and divots out on the road in that Mazda CX-9, and that's definitely the trade-off for improved handling. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we scored 71 decibels, which puts this right in the thick of things for this three-row crossover segment. In terms of overall fuel economy, I'm going to give this an A-. You will find better fuel economy in something like that Mazda CX-9 in real-world driving if we're talking about the non-hybrid trim. And in this hybrid trim, we have been averaging 26.5 miles per gallon, which is actually a little bit lower than the EPA says we should get. Interestingly enough, I actually averaged better fuel economy in the previous generation of this hybrid system than in this model. As you'd expect out of a vehicle that sells more than 100,000 units a year, there are a large number of ways you can configure your Highlander. The important thing to keep in mind about the chart in front of you is that the $30,630 base LE model is the only one with that 2.7-liter four-cylinder engine. Not too many people select the Highlander with that four-cylinder for a few reasons. It's actually not as efficient as the V6, and it's definitely not as fast as the V6, and it does not get the 8-speed automatic like we see in the V6 either. As we see in the Camry, the Corolla, and a number of other Toyota models, even the base version of the Highlander now includes their latest active safety systems, which includes radar adaptive cruise control functionality, auto high beams, pedestrian detection, autonomous braking, and lane departure warning with lane keeping assistance. The active safety technology is a pretty big differentiator for the Toyota brand lately, because although these same features are offered by just about every other manufacturer out there, they're not often offered in the base models, and they're really not standard in any of the competition. You'll note on this chart that you can now get the hybrid drivetrain in the LE trim. That's a little bit different than Highlanders of the past, where the hybrid system was really only available in the top-end trims. I'm generally very pro-hybrid, as you've probably noticed. For instance, if you're buying a 2018 Toyota Camry, I would probably buy the hybrid before I bought the four-cylinder model. The big deal there, of course, is that not only does the Camry Hybrid have very few drawbacks, but it actually improves on the regular Camry in a few ways. But things are a little bit different with the Highlander Hybrid. Yes, fuel economy is a little bit better than the regular Highlander, and the average family could save about $300 to $350 a year in terms of overall fuel costs, but jumping into that hybrid model will set you back between $2,800 and $4,000, depending on the trim that you're looking at. And that puts the break-even for the hybrid model around 8 to 9 years versus a comparable V6 model. But there are a few drawbacks to getting the Highlander Hybrid versus the non-hybrid model. The biggest of them, of course, is the all-wheel drive system. Because we have that electric all-wheel drive axle in the rear, you can only get 68 horsepower to the rear wheels. That's very different than the regular Highlander. For many shoppers out there, the all-wheel drive system should be just fine. But if you regularly find yourself in moderate to deep snow, you're probably going to want to get the mechanical all-wheel drive system that we find in the regular V6 Highlander. One key thing to keep in mind with the Highlander Hybrid, of course, is that you don't lose the 8-passenger ability. And that's kind of unusual, because when you opt for a Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid, you actually lose the 8th seat in that minivan, whereas in this relatively smaller crossover, we actually don't. On the flip side, of course, the rear seat is fairly compact in the Highlander, and the way they get to that 8-seat capacity is by putting a 3-person bench seat in the back. That brings us right along to the cons section. That tight third row is definitely a con for the Highlander. Of course, it is important to keep in mind that the Highlander is on the smaller end of the 3-row crossover segment. This is definitely smaller than something like a Chevy Traverse or Ford Explorer or some of the minivan competition. On the pros side of things, we have excellent fuel economy, whether we're talking about the hybrid model, which definitely bests the average three-row crossover, or the 3.5-liter V6 non-hybrid model with the 8-speed automatic. The Highlander also has an excellent value proposition, even in the base model, thanks to the addition of those active safety systems. As you step your way on up the trim ladder, that value holds, and when you compare this to models like the Kia Sorento or the Hyundai Santa Fe, which are also strong value leaders, the Toyota does incredibly well. Reliability and expected reliability are also very high for the Highlander. On the downside, in addition to that tight third row, we have a fairly small cargo area, yet again because of the overall size of the Highlander. Now let's talk about the Honda Pilot, probably the closest competitor to the Highlander. There's some decent advantages to buying the Toyota over the Honda. Although a base V6 Highlander is actually going to be about $2,000 more expensive than the base Honda Pilot, which gets the V6 standard, you do get all of those active safety systems standard in the Toyota. And of course you get the 8-speed automatic versus the 6-speed auto that we find in the base Pilot. That really has a positive impact on real-world fuel economy as well as real-world 0 to 60 performance. Personally, I like the interior styling of the Honda Pilot a little bit more than the Highlander. It just appeals to my sensibilities just a little bit more. But the 8-speed auto that we find in the Highlander really is a compelling selling feature, especially if we start taking a look at top-end trims of the Pilot, because the Touring and Elite trims of the Pilot use the ZF 9-speed automatic transmission made by ZF of Germany. This is the same automatic that we find in certain Land Rover models, certain Fiat Chrysler America models, and of course Honda and Acura models. It has some peculiar shift tendencies to it, and it just is a little rough around the edges compared to most other transmissions out there, especially the 8-speed that we find in the Toyota. The Toyota 8-speed automatic is incredibly smooth, and that's exactly why we find that essentially same transmission under the hood of certain Lexus models, as well as luxury cars like BMWs and Volvos. Now the Pilot does get an available torque vectoring rear axle, but I don't think that's enough to compensate for it in my book. It is going to handle a little bit better than the Highlander, but the difference is not huge. Like the Toyota Highlander, the Pilot is also available as an 8-passenger vehicle. And interestingly enough, there really are not very many 8-passenger crossovers or SUVs sold in the United States, but these are the two big players. What's odd about that, of course, is that the Pilot and the Highlander are not among the largest crossovers. So if you want a little bit more room in your third row, you're not going to be able to seat 8 passengers. You will find more room in the back of something like a Ford Explorer or a Dodge Durango or certain other large crossovers, but they're not going to seat 8 people. Next up, we have the Kia Sorento, which has been a longtime favorite here at Alex on Autos. If you're thinking that the Highlander might be just a little bit too big for you or a little bit too expensive, the Kia Sorento is a good alternative. The Sorento lives somewhere in the nether region between the compact crossovers like the RAV4 or the Nissan Rogue and the more mid-size crossovers like the Honda Pilot and the Toyota Highlander. It is available as either a 2-row crossover or a 3-row crossover, but the third row is more compact than the one that we find in the Highlander. Importantly, there is no 8-passenger version available of the Sorento. Although if you plan on putting 7 people in your crossover, especially if you're taking a look at the upper end trims of the Highlander and comparing them to the same model over there on the Kia side, your 7 passengers are going to be just about as comfortable, honestly. Because the way that they fit passengers in the back is a little bit different, as I said earlier. The Sorento would have a 2-person rear bench seat, which is actually going to be a little bit roomier, especially in terms of shoulder room and hip room, than the third row that we find in the Highlander. The Kia Sorento is about $3,000 less than a comparably equipped base V6 version of the Highlander. However, the Highlander really has an excellent value proposition, and once you factor in standard feature content on both models, the delta shrinks to only about $500 in favor of the Kia. On the other hand, in top-end trims, the Kia has a nicer interior than we find in the Highlander. So if you're looking at top-end trims, especially if you're treating that third row only as an emergency third row, then I would actually put the Kia Sorento on your shopping list slightly ahead of the Highlander. You will of course pay less for the Kia, but you won't find the same safety tech in those base trims. On the opposite end of things, we have the Ford Explorer. The Explorer is one of the most popular 3-row crossovers in North America for an important reason. It's large and it has very comfortable back seats. It also has quite a large cargo area for a crossover. Of course, it still won't hold quite as much cargo as a minivan, but we'll talk about that later. On the downside for the Explorer, it only seats 7. There is no 8-seat version like we find in the Highlander. It also gets lower fuel economy, even if we're talking about that 2.3-liter EcoBoost turbocharged engine. The Explorer does very well when it comes to acceleration, and there are of course more engine options available. Not only can you get that small EcoBoost engine, but there's also a much more powerful twin-turbo V6 that's available that will definitely take you from 0 to 60 faster than what we find in the Highlander. And of course, you're likely to find a better deal on the Explorer at the Ford dealer than you are at the Toyota, because it generally seems to sell below MSRP compared to what we see on the Highlander. The strong value proposition and the low price really puts value in a dead heat with the Highlander, even when we take into account those active safety systems. Of course, you won't find those safety systems in the Explorer in those low-end trims, so if you're really interested in those active safety bits and baubles, then you're really going to want to take a look at that Highlander. And lastly, we must talk about minivans as the practical alternative and as the hybrid alternative, since we were driving the Highlander Hybrid this week. Comparisons between the Highlander Hybrid and the Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid are inevitable and pretty easy to see. They're both three-row vehicles, they both have a solid family focus to them, and they're both hybrids. There are also very few three-row hybrid vehicles in America, and it really makes a lot more sense to compare the Highlander Hybrid to something like the Pacifica Hybrid than the Acura MDX Hybrid, which has a very different mission in mind. First key difference, obviously, is that the Pacifica is a minivan. The second key difference is that it's a plug-in hybrid, not a traditional hybrid. So if you want to plug your Pacifica in, you can go about 30 miles, EV only, and then it will default to hybrid operation. Being an average American minivan, the Pacifica is, of course, front-wheel drive only, although again, a lot of shoppers out there really are buying front-wheel drive Highlanders, so it's not too big of a stretch. The key selling points for the Pacifica plug-in hybrid would be that you can get the carpool stickers in California, and it qualifies for a variety of tax credits and rebates. Those tax credits and rebates mean that the Pacifica is actually going to be less expensive than the Highlander Hybrid. Of course, the real surprising thing about the Pacifica is that it also managed to beat the Highlander when it came to fuel economy by a few miles per gallon. We averaged over 30 miles per gallon in that large minivan driving it around town. And the Pacifica will swallow about 3 times the cargo that we can in the Highlander, and it has a very comfortable third row. Now, Chrysler for some reason removes the 8th passenger seat in the Pacifica when they turn it into a hybrid, so it will still only seat 7. However, those 7 people are going to be notably more comfortable than you'll find the Highlander. Our bottom line with the 2017 Highlander is that Toyota has tweaked it to make it more efficient and a better value for 2017, and it really shows. Those are 2 big wins for the family crossover segment. It's not as practical as the larger options in this segment, and some people have derided it for that. I've even commented on it in this video already. But that actually is what makes the Highlander so attractive to certain families. It has a usable third row, but it still could be treated as an emergency third row. But that size difference is actually why my top pick in this particular segment is still the 2017 Kia Sorento, because I prefer the more compact dimensions of the Kia, and I also like the way the interior looks, especially in the top-end trims. However, the Highlander comes in a definite strong second, and I would recommend it above the Honda Pilot or the Hyundai Santa Fe at this time, and if you can give up a little bit of third-row comfort, definitely over the Ford Explorer as well. It's a decent amount more efficient than the Ford, and I think it's a better overall package as well. Of course, if you're looking at the hybrid model or you plan on using that third row regularly, then I would strongly suggest getting the Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid instead. Thanks for checking out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 Toyota Highlander. Be sure and check out those related videos down there. Hit the subscribe button. You can also find us over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos to see what we're driving today, and head over to patreon.com if you want to support this channel. I'll see you next week.